let's see here, gotta click to advance the slide. Joan and Laurie wanted me to talk a little bit about, how I got into it as a child. And it happens to be Women's History Month, so good time to remember the role of women. And it's appropriate here because my mother had a big influence on me growing up. She was a member of the Wisconsin Society for Ornithology, kind of halfway between an amateur ornithologist and a professional. She was mostly a teacher, but she had her summers free to do a lot of bird watching, and took me out at the ripe old age of 6 or so into the forest with her neighborhood friends. And I remember that, of course, because they brought along sweet rolls to have with their coffee. So I got to nibble on those at 6. But it was much more than that, because a little bit later on, she took me up when I was about 10, I think. She took me up to the blinds to watch the booming grounds of the prairie chicken. We have a small remnant population in Wisconsin. It was much larger at one time, and that's where I grew up and lived in Wisconsin. And anyway, you could go into these blinds. It was an organized event. You'd have to get there about 4 in the morning. It'd be pitch black, and you'd walk in there with flashlights, get into the blinds with my mother. And I don't remember if my sister was along. Anyway, then you try to stay as warm as you can until the prairie chickens fly in and do their little booming dance, which I'm showing there on the left side of the screen. And it's absolutely fascinating, but you're not there just to observe. You're there to take down data, and they make us write down all the activity, how many pairs are on the booming grounds, which is also called a lek, and the activity that goes on, the male versus female activity. So anyway, it made a big dent in my life, and led me to spending a lot of time in nature, and eventually in professionally. And I did a lot of things professionally, a lot of rare plant surveys up in the far northern forests of the UP of Michigan and Minnesota, the national forests. Did a lot of rare plant surveys up there. And in fact, I did that during summers when I was getting my PhD. My PhD was on prairies. And that's partly what gave me the interest in Sandplain Grasslands. This is one of our, easy to get to prairies in Wisconsin, right on the Mississippi River. It's called the Bluff Prairie in the unglaciated area. So they're really hilly, absolutely beautiful prairies. And I just thought I'd show a little bit more about my research. This is just one of the, 21 sites or so I was doing plant transects on, and soil analysis as well. Here's another prairie in the driftless area, thin soil over limestone. We had really good limestone prairies there. This is showy, a very showy plant, Dodecathion shooting star. So some of the prairies are extremely colorful at certain times of year. This is the prairie in Wisconsin, also on a sand terrace. So it's actually the most like ours here in Massachusetts and Long Island and up in Maine. So that's of interest. Deep soil sand, flat ground, lots of fire. I did actual experimental research using these mesocosms. And I had a friend who was a wholesale honey dealer. So he had lots of extra barrels. And I used them and filled them with soil, laid them out in an array, and did study on 5 different species of prairie grasses that were native to Wisconsin to see which ones would dominate under certain conditions. And I did a lot of soil analysis too. We had lots of different soils. There's you see in the lower right, some of the really deep, rich prairie soils there are just incredible. And then a lot of mind-bending statistical analysis, but it actually is a little bit relevant here that I ended up finding that percent sand in the soil had a really high influence on the community composition of the prairies, as well as soil depth. I wanted to talk about the Sandplain Grassland Network that is a big part of this presentation tonight. We've been working together for 8 or so years, ever since I arrived in Massachusetts. And so you'll often see the little colorful icon we had an artist draw up on the slides. I don't know if you can see, I made my cursor really big. I don't know if you can see it, but I work for the Division of Fisheries and Wildlife. So their little icon is over here. And then within that, I'm in the Natural Heritage and Endangered Species Program. And so I represent those two as part of the, in the coalition that forms the Sandplain Grassland Network. And before I forget, you can go online pretty easily. Maybe we can throw this in the chat. Either Lori or Joan can find it online. The URL for that is really simple. It's like sandplaingrassland.net. And you'll see, I don't know, 6 or 7 tabs about our research and about the sites and other things. So you can learn a little bit more about the group. We have conferences every once in a while. And it's been a really productive collaboration. So how did Sandplain Grasslands get here? Because when I was in Wisconsin, and I know people all over the US read an elementary school that when the colonists landed in Plymouth Rock and got off the boat in 1620, they startled a squirrel, and the squirrel ran up a tree and ran down a limb and kept running westward to the Mississippi and didn't hit the ground. Because the trees, it was an extensive forest all over the East Coast. Well, now we know from various sources that that wasn't true at all. And it wasn't even true in New England, which if you go to the Berkshires, might think was heavily forested everywhere. And maybe most of the Berkshires was, but not the Cape and the Islands and parts of Plymouth and Bristol counties. Certainly, and parts of Worcester even, and a few of the inland spots as well. But I wanted to talk about this book. I got a couple books I'm going to mention. I like to read, and I advise it. And this particular book came out exactly 40 years ago. A famous book about the ecology of New England. It's extremely well written. It's not that long, and you can buy it at almost any used bookstore for $10 or so, take it home with you and read through it. And it's really well written. It's an easy read, but it's full of ecological details and very well referenced book. The year after he wrote it, he won, and I'm not seeing the text there, but he won the Francis Parkman Award in 1984, which is the Society of American Historians. So it's the most prestigious award for any historian that you can win writing a book. And this book won that. Now, he ended up being at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, but when he wrote this book, he was in Yale, and Yale has some excellent archives that he was able to really do a deep dive into, going way back in history and find the original texts of some of the folks that were here writing in English in the 17th century. So it's a fascinating book. Changes in the Land. And one of the things he said was, I click to go, that there were many patches of open land and that the Native Americans were frequently in the habit of torching the whole place. I'll get to a little bit more of that later. And so continuing the myth, but as a botanist, I don't only read books, I like to read plants. And so coming from Midwestern prairies, I had a sense of what plants kind of fit together in that community and how stable and long-lived that particular plant community might be. In the Midwest, we have prairies are kind of along a whole gradient of moisture from really wet to really dry. And then there's a few other types thrown in like the sand prairies and things, but it's quite clear from looking at pristine examples of those what the community of plants is and should be. And I'm seeing the same thing when I came out here eight and a half years ago, maybe. I guess I'm about to start my 9th field season here. These are a couple of examples of plants that play well with others, and they need low cover, so they're pure sandplain grassland specialists for the most part. Of course, all plants can occur where you don't expect them. They don't always read the books, but we'll get back to this. Some of them have, to this plant on the left, some of them have the actual name in their common name of sandplain. So on the left is sandplain blue-eyed grass, Sisyphicium fuscatum, and on the right, whorled milkwort. And a couple more examples before I get on to other things. And basically I'm saying the conservative plant species say, no, that squirrel could not have made it across here. And what does that mean, conservative plant species? Well, those are the species that I mentioned a little bit before that are play well with others, but they also don't play well with new invaders or a lot of disturbance or sites that have been really altered by humans in some way. It might not be bulldozed, it might be hydrology that could have been altered to change the wetness of the soil, the depth of the moisture in the soil, and that sort of thing. But these plants that are conservative are more faithful to the sites that have not been altered. And we look to them to tell us that, yes, we've been here a very long time and we're part of this interesting and fascinating habitat. On the left, you can see some lovely forbs in full flower, the eupatorium, which is, I have to stumble sometimes over common names, Hyssop-leaf, boneset, and showy aster. But I want you to see and notice, and I'm going to show this again later, that how well the plants are intermixed. I call it interdigitated, like you're putting your fingers together, right? There's nothing dominating here. And so it leads to a lot of species richness. There'll be a lot of species here, not just plants, but other insects, mosses, lichens, and so on, birds. But there'll be species richness and high species diversity, and there'll be stability over time. So getting onto the habitat itself and onto some of the animals, one of the reasons that we focus on these habitats, which sometimes we call natural communities, is because this is a way to help conserve all the taxa. All the animals, all the plants, all the fungi, all the lichens, and you could say even the bacteria and the nematodes and all that stuff. Lots of things that you have not discovered yet will be in the mix here in these communities. But here are a couple of examples from of the birds that inhabit them. These are some state threatened species, the grasshopper sparrow in the upper middle there. And harrier on the right. If you've never seen a harrier hunt, well, I hope you do soon, because it's fascinating to watch them and their technique, which is, similar to short-eared owl that I'll show in a second. On the lower left is purple tiger beetle. These are also predatory insects that can move very fast and have a fascinating ecology. And then in the middle, one I saw on a Sandplain grassland last September on the vineyard, chain dot geometer. It's normally rare, but because that site has been well managed, there were like hundreds of them flying by us on that day and landing like right on my finger. It was a pretty neat experience. There's our short-eared owl in the bottom there, and they're amazing flyers too. And a little bit more of the habitat at the Linda Loring Foundation, one of our Sandplain Grassland cooperators. Another state endangered bird is the upland sandpiper. Those tend to need really large tracts of open ground. So they've been in decline and they're rare, but some birds are past decline and onto extinct. And this is one. I bring it up because it used a portion of the ecosystem of Sandplain Grassland that we call Sandplain Heathland to feed on bayberry, but also lots of blueberries and huckleberries during migration. They nest up in the Arctic, and they came down by the thousands and fed before they took off for another 8,000-mile flight or so further south. Now there's another, this is my second book I'm going to recommend. You can see in 1955, it sold for $1.75. It's a little bit more than that, but I think you can still find it for $4 or $5, and it's a light book and another paperback, and really easy to read and fascinating. I'll tell you all about the curlews and how they did or didn't survive Nantucket. So we know at one time that a large portion of Nantucket had either Sandplain grassland or Sandplain heathland or closely related habitat types. And it's, you know, it's very sad to see this bird go extinct, but it's not the only one, because we can say that the heath hen was in part our doing here in the state. We didn't figure out what the habitat was, and we didn't know how to maintain it. And it literally, the last one of its kind passed away on Manuel Corella State Forest on Martha's Vineyard in 1932. Now on the left, you'll see the DCR, who's one of the collaborators at Waquoit Bay. They have a very nice sign out there now, so got to give them credit for that, about the heath hen. And on the right, my friend Chris Bulow wandered into the library in North Brookfield in central Massachusetts and found a stuffed specimen of the heath hen and took this wonderful photograph and gave it to me just the other day for this program. They preferred a type of habitat that's, again, related, but not exactly the same. Scrub oak barrens. It has a couple of shrubby oak species, one of which I will show later. But no doubt for their lekking grounds, their booming grounds, they would have used patches of more pure sandplain grasslands, because that's the best place for a male heath hen to display his talents to the onlooking females. Now I'm going to talk about a couple of birds that are just declining. Bob White is one that uses a lot of open habitat. I'm using some graphics and data from Mass Audubon, who does a wonderful job on birds of Massachusetts on their website, and detailing many of the things. Now, why the Bob White? Well, you can see from these habitat maps, the breeding bird census maps, that they strongly favor the Cape and sometimes parts of the island, these open habitats down here. Other sites they used were probably old ag fields. These are atlas blocks. They do breeding bird surveys over a several year period. The one on the left was from 2007 to 2011. And these are like 30 square kilometer blocks. So they'll spend several seasons and just confirming the breeding birds that are actually nesting on those sites. And then on the right, you can see the change, because, did I say that wrong? On the left is 1974. I think I said that wrong. This one over here is the older one with lots more birds. And then in 2007, this one is their latest census data. And you can see a huge decline, as we saw in the previous. So these habitats are declining. They need our protection. They need our help. So I mentioned 3 types of habitats. Here's a 4th that I don't really have a name for. There might be a name. This is probably taken on Nantucket, but it's the near shore open and sandy habitat. But a lot of the components of sandplain grasslands can occur here and do occur here, but the much lower cover. But one important plant is featured here and shows up nicely, this Pityopsis falcata, sickle-leaved golden aster. And I'm going to dwell on that for just a moment while I show and discuss the map of it. Now what kind of a map is this? This is an iNaturalist observation map, which is why I was asking Joe and Lori a little bit about whether they do citizen science. Part of what I like to do is encourage people to get involved with this. It's very easy to do. And certain species, like this very colorful sickle-leaved aster, are very good to do with iNaturalist because people can identify them easily and they're easy to take good pictures of. So this map that we're seeing are all the observations in the entire world of Pityopsis falcata. That makes it a real New England, New York, Long Island, Northern New Jersey endemic. This is a very small range for a plant to have this small, but this is it for the whole world. So it's ranked a so-called G3, very globally rare, globally threatened. And then there are 2 more rare categories below that. So it's if you were to look at the distribution of this plant in using herbarium records, in other words, historic records, the distribution would be essentially identical, which is rather remarkable. Usually iNaturalist records aren't quite that remarkable, but consider getting involved. It's totally free, and the best form of social media, I think. So you could send comments back and forth to each other. I know Steve Young has been on this. He's in the audience here, and he and I have been chatting back and forth about various species along the coast and things. So again, getting back to the myth that it was all forest, after some of that idea was abandoned, then they said, well, okay, so maybe it wasn't all forest, but it was agricultural land, and that's what created the Sandplain Grasslands. So somehow, I think the hypothesis is that these species, all these species, some of the ones I just showed you, were just hanging out on the edges in these tiny little hedgerows or something. And then when the ag fields were abandoned, they all moved in with abandon, so to speak, and set up a new plant community in 200 years. I just don't buy that theory. I know that's what some of the scientific research says, but I think there's a lot of evidence in the plants themselves against that. And there's evidence in other ways as well. So where do these sandplain grasslands occur, and why do they occur where they do? And the reason is primarily these glacial outwash plains. This one happens to be a delta deposit from Lake Nashua, glacial Lake Nashua, which dissolved and disappeared long ago, but left these deep sandy deposits. These are nutrient poor soils. They're not like those rich prairie soils I showed you from Wisconsin. They're very nutrient poor, and they're very droughty. Now, droughty soils means two things. It's harder for the plants to grow well throughout the season, but it also means much more frequent fire is likely. The soil will dry out, the plants will dry out, and fire can come, and that has a secondary effect essentially on the plant community. Here's a couple maps, and on the right you see in black the moraines from the Wisconsin Glacier, which ended somewhere around 18,000 years ago. So this would be the end of the big blocks of ice, and sometimes these moraines, the ice would just sit there for quite a while, but there was lots going on, right? There were rivers of water running underneath and through and over the top of the ice at times, all carrying sand. And that would get pushed out and distributed in the rivers that came out of the moraines. And these rivers would go twist back and forth, depositing sand in a very level situation. And then, of course, when the glacier disappeared and the water of the land rose back up again and the sea level declined a little bit, then leaving the land high and dry, I guess my point. Then these outwash plains were there at the edge, at the end of the moraines, and then they provide the right soil for these. On the left, you can see sort of a one-to-one match between these outwash plains and our Sandplain Grassland study sites that we've looked at over time. Whoops, wrong direction. And here is Steve Young right there. And he was former, now recently retired state botanist of New York. So he and I were at this meeting that we had in the Hempstead Plains, which is right here. This is an old map of Long Island, 1859. And the Hempstead Plain was a huge sandplain grassland, 40,000 acres, essentially unbroken. And you could see little colonial roads through there at the time, people riding those roads on horseback in late August of any year would report the fields are essentially pink with Agellinus acuta, the Sandplain Gerardia that I will show you very soon. So a very important site. There's only about 12 acres left or so out of 40,000. So that's obviously pretty severe disappearance. There's a few other sites on Long Island that Polly Wigand has showed us. She's right there. And there are a few more really important sites on Long Island. They're all small and they're hard to maintain, but they're important sandplain grassland sites historically as well as current day. Now, could they all have formed in these little pockets? Well, it's likely they didn't. It's likely there was a ton of habitat offshore in what we call the late glacial maximum, when the ice was at its mostest in the Wisconsin Glacier. So it was a lot of the ocean water was in the form of ice, and so sea levels were about 300 feet lower at the peak. So that exposed a lot of land, pretty much all of these Nantucket shoals, and lots of other land around that. So it would have connected a lot of the areas, and plant communities could have formed and moved all across there. And we'll see in a moment that there's some evidence that they did just that. The shoals are about 25 miles by 40 miles in dimension, and that's, if you multiply that together, that's 1,000 square miles of habitats. That's a lot of habitat on which to form plant communities. I'm sure they weren't all Sandplain grassland, they were a variety of things, but certainly out there was no doubt some of the Sandplain grassland species hanging out. Here's some of the evidence, not with the Sandplain grassland species, but in fact with the coastal plain pond species, one of everybody's favorite who lives on the Cape or Plymouth County and has walked the shores of the coastal plain ponds. This is Plymouth gentian, super colorful. And we see the distribution of that on the right. The global distribution, a little bit on the North-South Carolina border by the sea, lots in Massachusetts and a little in Rhode Island, and then some up in Nova Scotia. I moved something around on my screen there. Yeah. How could you have a plant that would have that distribution? We would want to know, right? Why isn't it in there too? Why isn't it up here too? It must have existed somewhere else, right? Well, turns out that, before I get to that, another iNaturalist note. This program is not brought to you by iNaturalist. They didn't pay me anything. But you can see the distribution, again, because it's a very colorful plant, is absolutely identical to the historic distribution of this species. The advantage, of course, is this is not historic. These are people who saw the plant like last year or the year before that, and had multiple people weigh in saying, yes, it is indeed that plant, or no, it's not, it's a different species. Here's the paper I was about to discuss that where they decided to genetically analyze all the DNA sequences from all these populations and try to figure out, like, where did the population in the center come from? And it turned out it didn't really come from Nova Scotia. It didn't really come from North-South Carolina, but instead predominantly, or maybe entirely, this is a 2015 paper, it came entirely or mostly from that offshore continental shelf. It was a remarkable paper at the time. A lot of people had hypothesized that, but this paper really strongly supported it. So it's kind of fascinating that way. Now, that's not the only bit of evidence, because we have, we can imagine that Sandplain grasslands might have come from the continental shelf. They might have come a little bit from plants living further north, or plants living on that, say, New Jersey coastal plain or Long Island, or even further south in North Carolina, and moved on up as the climate warmed after glaciation. But we also know that it's likely a lot of plants came from the west, from tall grass prairies and the other types of prairies that I showed you in the Midwest, along this periglacial front that would have occurred around 11,000 to 9,000 years ago or so. Glacier's really good at bulldozing soil. So it moves back and forth, it recesses and advances, leaves nice piles of gravel, no competition for plants. So they can seed in there and form these plant communities if they have thousands of years to do it. And we know botanically, a lot of plants from the Atlantic coastal plain, including Massachusetts, moved along that periglacial front from east to west. I know that because the first plants that I know are common now in Massachusetts, I learned in Wisconsin, and they were called Atlantic coastal plain disjuncts. There was Carex folliculata, one of the tall sedges. There was Massachusetts fern. There was Rexia. meadow beauty is the common name for that. There were several Bartonia species. There were a bunch of really cool plants like that. They had all moved along that periglacial front. Since glaciation, the intermediate populations had all been wiped out, but there they were hanging out in Wisconsin along what was known to be a glaciated area. So now we have evidence with these flightless leafhoppers that just the opposite direction moved happened with these leafhoppers. They're flightless, so they can't move very far, maybe a mile a year. But if you have 1,000 years, you can move 1,000 miles. And they are restricted to these prairie species. They're entirely and completely faithful to those species. They're obligates on these prairie species. And would be really hardly any way to explain these various genera of insects being located here unless they come across that periglacial front. So we had plants forming the Sandplain Grasslands for the past 10,000 years roughly, moving along in various directions and forming these plant communities. What maintains them, what kept them open, what was documented in Changes in the Land, the book I first showed? Well, partly at least, it was fire. Fire was frequent, we think, before the time of European settlement. And it's still frequent today in some ways. These are people deliberately lighting it off. I would think, since it's probably my picture, and I think it's from Massachusetts, that it's our DFW. We do a lot of burning now, the Division of Fisheries and Wildlife, and in combination with DCR, we've able to get a real good crew together and some good equipment. So I think in a good year, they burn something like 1,000 acres. So for Massachusetts, that's really good. And it maintains these habitats. Well, why do we think there was so much fire prior to European settlement? Surveyors, when they did all the surveying of all the towns and all the surveying that they needed to do in Massachusetts in the 17th and 18th century, they would map out every time they crossed an Indian trail, or they would possibly be utilizing Indian trails as well. So somebody put all those maps together. And if you think we weren't heavily settled by Native Americans, well, this map would blow smoke into that, perhaps literally. And one of the things we know about a lot of early Native American tribes is that they were seasonal. They moved where the food was dense, and that changes during the season. So they moved. Now, remember when they moved, they were moving men, women, and children. They were moving us senior citizen types. They were moving very young children. They didn't want to have to fight through a lot of thick brush to get from one place to another. And so if you're in that situation, fire is your friend. And the more frequently you burn, the easier it's going to be to go across the landscape. We know from working with the Mashpee Wampanoag that their fire history goes way back. And they have started to work with us in prescribed fire here on the Cape, and they'll be continuing that in the next several years. Working by us, I mean Division of Fisheries and Wildlife. So that's an exciting development for us. Getting back to fire for a sec, you might think, I just said that they used it partly to make transportation easy, but there's so many other reasons that Native Americans had to burn. And I'll just touch on one of them for a sec. If you are living in a flammable house and you're surrounded by flammable material, like some of the pictures I've been showing, and it's springtime and a warm wind comes along and you smell smoke, you're going to want to have some protection against flames coming in. And I'm just going to tell a little joke I heard on Prairie Home Companion once, where that was their old radio show out of Minnesota. So the Minnesota guy calls the fire department and he says, help, my house is on fire. Come quick. And they said, okay, how do we get there? And he pauses for a second and he says, don't you have those red trucks? Well, the idea is, my point is here, Native Americans did not have those red trucks. They did not have pumper equipment. They did not have roads. They had to find some other way to defend themselves against wildfire. as well as I said, intentionally for either clearing off land that they were going to plant or for ease of transportation. So just think about that when somebody tells you Native Americans didn't burn historically. They had to in a flammable landscape. So on to the next. And then even without that, of course, we had a drought last year. Here's all the wildfires that were burning in Massachusetts between just August 1 and August 23rd. Some fires burned for 8 continuous days because the soil was so dry that it burned down into the soil and just kept going. This would have happened, could have happened anytime in the past, 5,000 to 6,000 years. And those fires, without the red trucks around, would have just kept on going across the entire landscape. So fire was a big factor in former times. Other factors that could have kept some landscape open were Pleistocene megafauna, hurricanes, and salt spray. I know my friend Kelly Omond is on the talk, and she lives in the center of Nantucket. And even on just a really windy day, which should be, I don't know, 5 miles from the seashore, she had salt on her windshield. So salt spray gets all the way across some of our, what we consider to be fairly large islands, even without hurricanes. And that can have an effect, of course, on the vegetation. Some species are better able to handle it than others. Let's get to some sites so you can see a little bit more about what sandplains are like. So this is trade winds on Martha's Vineyard, and just a couple of slides to show what it's like. And what we see here is a very flat landscape. This is also a grass runway for airplanes. They get just a few landings a year. You can see the windsock down at the very end there. There's an interesting correlation between sandplain grasslands and grass runways. There are a couple of them on Martha's Vineyard alone. And it's because they're on these flat outwash plains where the soil is just right. The one we'll see later up in Maine was also very close to a flat outwash plain airport, small airport, little town airport kind of thing. Here you see the yellow baptisia in bloom mainly, and a little bit of the butterfly weed. And here's more butterfly weed, and the site manager, Julie Russell, here is a great botanist. She manages the site. And here's Julie's hand reaching down at the base of sandplain blue-eyed grass that I showed earlier. And one of the things that happens when you burn, well, the base of the plants get black, but it also exposes this mineral soil, which is a great seed bed for these fire-adapted species. So when the seeds land, they don't have to fight their way through the duff. On the right, you'll see the very thick rootstocks and root crowns of this species. So they bury, fire-adapted species tend to bury a little bit more underground than they'll put up on top. When botanists call it the root-shoot ratio. The root-shoot ratio is higher. There's more root to more shoot there so that they can flourish when the fire comes through, pop right back up. Another colorful species is the racemed milkwort, very common on sandplain grasslands. Here's another site that we discovered some federally listed plants on, but it's got the classic flat look to it and deep sandy soil. And this site happened to have Liatris novae anglii, the New England blazing star, and my final, I hope, iNaturalist map showing the one-to-one correlation between historical records and modern day records, because it's so easy and clear to photograph and identify this species online. But three examples of how you can join in as a citizen scientist and help us document the distribution and density and abundance and condition of some of our rare native species. Again, a very narrow distribution overall. So this is globally rare as well. It's only special concern in Massachusetts because we have a fair amount. We're probably the stronghold here. Here it is on that same site that we were just walking into. And they're very good nectar sources for pollinators. You see the monarch here. One of my favorite plants is on sand plains is this clasping leaf milkweed. You'll see these really beautiful leaves and beautiful plant. And if you ever get a chance to smell, look at how beautiful that color is. An incredible sort of mauve coloration. And the smell is just absolutely heavenly. Exotic, you might say. Now, why is this one of my favorite plants? You see on the right, these funky looking curly leaves. Well, I'm gonna click and you'll see a little animation here. Here comes the emoji. This is what it reminds me of, right? You know what that is? That's a slightly drunk or tipsy emoji. And that's what the curling leaves look like to me. And every time I see them, I kind of think of that, the way cartoonists draw. So Sandplain Gerardia that I mentioned on the Hempstead Plains, federally endangered. It's getting combined into another taxon, but I won't go into that now. It'd still be globally rare. We have great populations on Massachusetts. It's an annual species and very faithful to Sandplain Grasslands. Here we are counting it, which we try to do every year. This is at Francis Crane Wildlife Management Area, just up the road from Waquoit Bay, but one of our largest sites, as you can see. They're not just grasses in these grasslands, they're sedges, and here's a very rare state endangered one. See in the lower right, it has these little white balls for seeds, Scleria passiflora. We're staring at it down here in the matrix. Can you imagine trying to find this little thing in the matrix of grass? But we did. And as these seeds, another indication that fire was frequent at one time in these systems, because they will rarely germinate without fire. They have a very hard coat. Here we are finally at Waquoit Bay, and this is a restoration. Somebody planted Aegolinus a while back and it flourished here because the soil is just perfect for it. When they get really dense, we have to count with quadras. So there was several hundred in here, and then we can estimate the total population. This is Ashlyn Treadway, a late fall intern from 2017. And she's out in Oregon now, unfortunately. So more pictures though. Here, stepping back from that first one, a little later in the day, so shade has fallen on the counters. But this is a really great Sandplain grassland example right here at headquarters. When I say here, I mean Waquoit Bay Reserve here. A couple more shots of this site here because it's so important. And Eurybia spectabilis here, the showy aster, and a nice view with the matrix of plants, the interdigitation that I mentioned. Oldfield goldenrod is present there, and lots of little blue stem in the picture, a different angle on some of the headquarters buildings. And a closer look at this absolutely lovely plant, Eurybia spectabilis, the showy aster. There are a few orchids in Sandplain Grasslands, and this one was at the Bayview Cemetery, just through on the path from the headquarters building at Waquoit Bay. Spiranthes tuberosa, and then on the right, another Sandplain Grassland specialist is Spiranthes vernalis. These Spiranthes genus has these wonderful spiral curves to them. So I hope you get a chance to see them. Now, Bayview Cemetery, if any of you know who's managing that, is not managed well. It is very much overmowed. This is a different cemetery in a different part of the Cape, also on flat sandy soil where Aegolinus still thrives. And this site is mowed, but it's not mowed after July 1st. So once July 1st comes around, they let it go till December. And there's no harm to the gravestones, of course, and but the plant still flourishes. And that's what we need at Bayview, because we're losing our Aegolinus there and some of the other native plants. We haven't been able to find a way to contact the right person to really be able to stop them from doing that. Here's another site right on the seashore of Martha's Vineyard with another rare grass, the Aristida needlegrass. Now my final site, and I'm almost done, Kennebunk Plains. It's such an interesting site that I'm gonna go into it just a little bit. Here's a map showing where it is. There it is on the upper part. You remember our site map from before. Well, this is another outwash plain, but way up here. here it is on a road map. So if you exit going north in Maine at Kennebunk and go west on Route 99 until you see the big brown sign there, then you can get out and park and walk for miles and several hours, and it's very entertaining. This site has the largest population of Liatris nova anglii that I know of, so it's probably the world's largest population, and flourishes because it's very well burned. In Maine, of course, they know about blueberry barrens, so they're properly equipped for burning. They know what to do, and it does grow blueberries. Now, I've said Sandplain Grasslands, but there are other grass-like species, some of which I mentioned. Here's another common sedge, shaved sedge. It's called Carex tonsa on the right. It has a very rugged feel to the leaves. And then on the left is a rush. So both of these are called graminoids. So they fit into the matrix and look like grasses, but they're part of the botanical diversity on a good Sandplain grassland site. But this site is full of interdigitation of all types, right? So it's got grasses, it's got sedges, it's got rushes, but it also has shrubs, but it's not a scrub oak barrens by any means, although it does have a little scrub oak. And it's not a sandplain heathland either, although it does have lots of blueberries. It just keeps changing wherever you walk. And so it's the most marvelous thing to visit. So on the left, we have Aronia melanocarpa. It goes all the way to the Midwest into prairies on this well-burned site. On Betula populifolia that never forms a tree here because it's burned down, but it likes fire just fine. Whoops, wrong way. Fire cherry, so named because it likes fire. That's on the right there with these big juicy looking cherries, quite edible. Also edible, hazelnut on the left, if you can get to the nuts before the squirrels do. And here's bare oak, a very fire tolerant and resistant scrub oak, part of the scrub oak barrens. And this would probably be all the bigger this one ever gets on Kennebunk Plains. And it's got really cool leaves and acorns and just really neat plant. And another sub-shrub, these short shrubs are sand cherry, which you don't often see, but it's a good component of Sandplain Grasslands up in Kennebunk Plains. Also produces edible fruit. And speaking of edible fruits, there's some blueberries mixed in, and also all the shadbush. How would you define this as a plant community? You really can't. It's in between all kinds of different things there. Orange grass is found in very open sandy habitats, but also into the mix into this Sandplain Grasslands. It's a hypericum, this one on the right here. And if you crush the foliage, it smells deliciously like citrus. On the left is the prairie lily, Lilium philadelphicum, also found in the Midwest. And here are the blueberries that the fires produce and that the people from nearby towns come and pick. The young girl there was not too happy having to work too hard, but when I showed her the orange grass, she was absolutely thrilled and delighted and scampered off saying, Mom, look, smell this. So that was kind of fun. More Liatris. And a couple of views. Look at the view of this amazing landscape here. It's Kennebunk Plains still. And there's my wife, Ann, walking across the plains when Liatris is blooming, and a little Nablus there too. And then ending back to the original theme of loving your mother. This person is loving Mother Earth here and blessing the Liatris at the Nantucket Airport in, I think it was 2015. So I recommend that to you if you get a chance. And my final shot is at the Kennebunk Plains with all the heavenly Liatris nova anglii. And with that, I will stop and thank you very much for your patience. And I'm sure you'll have some questions that I will now take.
Oh, what a beautiful slide to end off on. And thank you for an excellent presentation. We do have lots of questions, and maybe if anybody wants to add more questions to the chat box, you can. Lori, do you want to start us off?
Sure. We have a question and an observation, I think, from Kathleen Garnis. How do we stem the loss of botanical knowledge in our young people? I'm talking to ecologists who are hiring kids right out of school, and they're saying these kids have degrees in ecology and know zero native plants. So I'm not sure you can answer that, but maybe you want to add an observation.
It's a great question, and there's a lot of good botanists in the institution working on that very problem. You'll find it's more common, it's less common in research institutions like the one I went to, for people to help students learn the native plants. But, you know, right here in New England, we have the Native Plant Trust, and they go a long ways to teaching people in classes about our native plants, and also providing the resource online of the website Go Botany. That's so well done. It's used in the Midwest as well sometimes. But another thing, and I just had recent conversations about this on Twitter with a professor teaching botany at SUNY ESF up in New York. He said he's using iNaturalist as well with his students. And one of the things you can do with iNaturalist, and by the way, I teach a course on this up in northern Maine in end of July, early August at Eagle Hill. So if you're interested and you want to botanize in northern Maine, look up Eagle Hill Institute. But anyway, getting back to the professor, you can form projects in iNaturalist, and the students can then all be enrolled in this project, and then you can just send them out there with their phones. And the the system has algorithms to help begin to determine the plant, that it can roll back the taxonomic level. So it can identify, say, at the genus level or family level, and then you could try to take it in from there to try to get to the species level. So it's very helpful that way. I mean, I think there are a lot of ways to get people hooked on native plants. I mentioned the smell of a couple of plants here, orange grass. I mean, that 8-year-old girl, or however old she was in the Kennebunk Plains, she will remember that because of the smell. So there are little tricks like that to get people started in learning native plants. But I agree, it's a bit of a struggle nowadays, and people are kind of spending too much time staring at their phones. So if they're going to do that, make sure they have the iNaturalist app on their phone.
Thank you.
The next question, I think you might have answered this, but are you managing your sites with prescribed fire? And if so, how often?
As much as we can, and it varies. Some of the organizations are not able to do it because of either the board of directors or insurance regulations, or they don't have the staffing to do it. Sometimes insurance requires certain, there's a very hierarchical system in the National Wildfire Council or whatever it is. So you're given a card and everyone has like a certain rank and however many burns they've done. And so only certain people who are very experienced and very high up can be a burn boss and still be insured. And those people are hard to get, but burning is going on. Mass Wildlife gives away, I think, $500,000 a year in a granting process where organizations can apply to, it's strictly for restoration. And I know TNC, and I know got some money, and I know specifically on the vineyard, they got some good funding that will help them burn this year. So some of the sites are being burned. We actually burn a lot of our own sites as well. We have some interior sites near the Connecticut River that are big, either scrub oak barrens or bordering on Sandplain Grasslands. There's one in the town of Southwick, which borders Connecticut, which also at one time had a huge sandplain grassland that ended up getting destroyed by agriculture or whatever. At any rate, this place in Southwick, our wildlife management area, if you're ever near there and get a chance, it's just some also amazing, very large landscape that's getting very well burned, and lots of rare plants and unusual plants are showing up because of the fire management there. Same as at Montague Plains, and also at another place called Muddy Brook in the town of Hardwick in Massachusetts. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, in the reserve, their prescribed burn happened here not every year, but periodically. And last year was the last time that the front lawn was burned. The prescribed burn happened there.
Great.
So
great to hear.
All right.
Okay.
So we are getting at the 7:30 mark, but I really do want to let people get their questions answered. Is it all right if we keep going? Are you all right with that?
Sure. Yeah, sure.
If anybody has
to look at them as well.
Yep.
The next question I have is from Carmen. Is it possible to track Sandplain Grasslands through fossil pollens?
That's really difficult in a way because the pollen can be deceptive, and you have to have the right equipment and maybe the right amount of funding. It's probably better to, in some ways, track it through charcoal. Lots of the pollen, lots of the species aren't identifiable to species level through pollen. One thing that I've been wanting to see, and I haven't seen that in Massachusetts yet, is if you have just the right equipment, you can sample charcoal in those same pollen cores. I think he was talking about pollen cores, which are done in wetlands or bogs or things, where you can go back several hundred years or even further. If you can pull out the charcoal, and again, it takes just the right sort of charcoal, and then you can analyze it for stable carbon isotopes, you can find the level of warm season grasses versus cool season plants, C3 plants versus C4. And that will give you some idea of the level of warm season grasses on the site. But as far as I know, it's only been done in the Midwest so far because it takes specialized intent to do that. And it hasn't been done here yet. So the answer is maybe, but haven't seen it done yet.
Right, the next question, what was the origin of the prairie ecosystem along the Potomac River Gorge near Washington, D.C., and its relationship, if any, to our coastal Sandplain Grasslands?
I have never seen that, so I really can't comment on that. But it sounds like something that would have been part of what I imagine to have been a continuum from all the way from South Carolina on up to Massachusetts. I will say that there's another group further south that's really gotten off the ground and going strong, and it's called something like the Southeast Grasslands Initiative. I think that might be it. And they have a really good leader who is a teacher in Knoxville, a professor. Gosh, I've forgotten his name. He's a big burly guy. And he's gotten a lot of people organized, and they've done a lot of the same kind of almost like archaeological research, where you're finding these old grasslands that were there, and then if you manage them right, a lot of these old species will show back up again. Somebody, maybe Allie, put a link in. I wonder if that's right. That's right. Very good, Allie. Thank you. Southeast Grasslands Initiative. So she just put the link in the chat. It's a really great website, and just some amazing flora. And they've done so much work recovering the knowledge. They had to fight back the same sort of myth of the squirrel that, sorry, I've lost the screen now. there you are. The myth of the squirrel. Forgotten Grasslands of the South. Reed Noss is a good buddy of mine. Pete Grimm is posting that. So they've done so much good work along those lines. So I guess that Washington, D.C. then could have been maybe an edge component of that. And they're looking at some of the same interesting disturbance regimes that I discussed here, not just fire, but things like Pleistocene megafauna, or even more modern day buffalo, something on buffalo licks, I think, or buffalo, buffalo something. Specialized plants grow in those places. Somebody in the chat will help me out. Buffalo runs, I can't remember what they're called. Okay. I don't live in the Southeast, but Anyway, yeah, thanks for pulling that website up and mentioning the book too in the chat. That's just excellent.
I'm going to throw another question at you. Kathleen is asking, do you use standardized data recording protocols for monitoring rare plants?
Some of the groups do. We try to keep it simple so that we can keep repeating it every year. There's all kinds of ways to do it. What we do is mainly counts. And so on some of these sites, I'm bringing a lot of 150 meter tapes or 100 meter tapes and laying out transects. And then we take clicker counters and go through in 2 meter wide swaths and try to count and indicate what plants are flowering or just how many plants are there. And if you do that year after year, you can get a pretty good sense of what's going on in the plant community. But there are other things you could monitor at the same time, and it depends on the site. So like in a forest, you wouldn't do the same thing. You might count in a forest, for example, you might count coarse woody debris is often monitored, or in Sandplain Grasslands, if it was on that really open end, you could count, looking down on a transect, you could count the amount of open sand you would see, or open soil, unoccupied space. So there's all kinds of things you can do with pretty simple protocols. The main thing is to not get bogged down. I spent a couple years doing the National Wetlands Conditions Assessment, and their protocols are, I mean, we take an entire day to do a fairly small wetland area because the protocols were so complex, but then you wouldn't come back for like 5 years. So it was, I don't really, that has a very specialized kind of monitoring. So I advocate simple and repeat.
Okay.
Which, by the way, one more thing on that. There are new apps on the phone. There's an amazing app. I think I can bring it up here, and you can even hear it. It's called Counter. You maybe can't see it, but what I want you to do is just listen for a sec, because I'm going to hit this as a big screen and with a big button, and you just tap on it with your finger. Whoops, I got to have the sound turned up. And the numbers change, and you can put in counters for different species. It's super simple to use. So I can hold this in my left hand, walk along and kind of point at plants and keep clicking with my thumb and get a count. And then I can add different species and keep counting them as I go along. And then you reset at the end, or you can actually like download the results into a spreadsheet. Or so the new phone apps for doing monitoring are getting better and better. And of course, you would want to photograph your site as you go along, and you want to have your location on. So there's so much more you can do with a smartphone these days that couldn't be done 20 years ago.
All right. We're running a little late. I'm gonna skip to a couple more local questions. And if we have any questions we can't get to, do you think we could send them out in an email or something, or does that work? Well, anyway, I'm gonna.
You want to collate them? Yeah, one email would be good. I don't.
Yeah,
want,
I mean, we may. I just see there's a lot. So how can someone access?
Liz is suggesting buffalo wallows. I think that might be it, but I think, could it have been traces? Buffalo trace. I think that's what it was, which is an unusual word, but I think that's what it is. Maybe somebody will look it up. Yeah.
How can someone access the botanical studies from Francis Crane Wildlife Area?
Access the what?
Botanical studies from Francis Crane.
We've just started to pull together species lists, but what you can do is volunteer to come and count Agellinus with us, and you can learn a lot about the site by volunteering. It's we usually do it now just after Labor Day, like the first day that you can actually cross the bridges to get to the Cape.
Oh, great.
So you are welcome to get in touch with me if you want to volunteer for that. We do several on the Cape, and then we'll go over to the vineyard and count too. For some strange reason, Nantucket does not have Agellinus, not yet anyway. Kelly keeps finding more plants out there though, so you never know.
Okay, we will be sending out the presentation after, so maybe we can include your contact information for people who might want to volunteer with you. Or
Yeah.
they can.
Yep.
Here's another, can you have Sandplain grasslands on sandy sites, maybe old ag sites on coastal moraine?
Yes, definitely. They can be old ag sites. Like that's one of the theories, is that they came in that way. Coastal moraine, I don't know exactly what that is, or where you're referring to. There is a form of coastal moraine, of course, on the Aquinnah, and it does, the upper part of that does hold kind of like a sandplain grassland. It's its own unique thing too. So, but it's a fascinating place too. So I don't know if that's what you meant, but they can be there. Yes, I guess is the answer to that.
Okay.
All right, maybe we can end on this last one. What can this community do to help increase capacity of the Sandplain Grassland Network, and how I would like to coordinate some possible restoration efforts?
Yeah. Well, yeah, that you can get in touch with me on that too. I guess I'm hesitating just a little bit because we haven't really figured it out exactly. We're still sort of working on that, but we're interested in ideas on that. We have basically what we have is a steering committee, and we're trying to keep that relatively the same size so it doesn't become unwieldy. But we would be interested in reaching out on certain restoration efforts for sure, if they're in the right time and place. And we certainly would encourage that. So yeah, so they can reach out to me on that, and I would bring it up with the steering committee, several of whom are on the call tonight. Let's see, Liz Laux and Kelly, and maybe some others too.
Great. And also our stewardship coordinator asked us to put in a plug. If anyone would like to volunteer at the reserve pulling invasives, he would love to have help there. Somebody local. And Lori is our volunteer coordinator, so you can also contact her about that. So, whew. So this was a lot. We really learned a lot. If there's any questions that we did miss, we can send them to you. We can send it out in the email when we send out the recording. But it was a beautiful program. Lori, did you want to add anything else?